Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. And this is Jealousy and Human Behavior, Part 1 by Manly P. Hall. An article taken from Horizon, the magazine of useful and intelligent living, Volume 17, Number 3, Winter, 1957. Jealousy and Human Behavior by Manly P. Hall. There is no department of human behavior in which the teachings of Buddha could be of greater use to Western man than that which relates to jealousy. Buddhism makes a particular and special point of the problem of possessiveness and indicates clearly that from the long and sad story of human experience, jealousy is one of the heaviest burdens that an individual can inflict upon himself and those around him. Yet, in our Western way of life, there are a great many persons who demand jealousy of each other, regarding it as a virtue and considering themselves neglected unless a certain amount of jealousy centers around them. This problem is closely interwoven in the general pattern of a highly competitive way of life. We have long noted the disaster of competitive relationships, yet in the last 10 years this situation has increased in severity and has become an ever greater menace to individual and collective security. In a discussion of jealousy, there are certain points which should be clearly understood. Possessiveness, or the desire to possess, and the fears and resentments resulting from the loss of possessions, create a compound emotion which expresses itself in our Western living in two distinct ways: jealousy and envy. Jealousy is a possessive emotion which gradually deteriorates into a profound suspicion. It is part of our instinctive desire to be possessed and to possess other human beings, and is expressed through unreasonable doubts concerning the integrity or fidelity of persons for whom we have unusual affection. Because we desire to be the center of interest and attachment, we become jealous of any individual or circumstance by which this position is threatened in regard to the object of our affection. We can also be jealous of people for what they are, or of their moods and attitudes. Envy, on the other hand, deals largely with the possessions of others. We envy other persons, their estates, their positions in society, their circles of influence, their worldly goods. We envy that person whose opulence exceeds our own, or whom we regard as being unusually favored by Providence. Both jealousy and envy are obviously associated with our own standard of possession and our own peculiar attitude toward our role in the lives of our associates. These emotions bring with them inevitable sorrow, yet for the most part we are unable to overcome the instincts within ourselves which lead to these attitudes, although we may know perfectly well that they are unreasonable. The more we work with human beings, the more we realize that the average individual recognizes no capacity to change himself. He demands acceptance of his nature as it is, and when confronted by the challenge of self-improvement, he is likely to become angry, disconcerted, unpleasant, and to heap abuse upon someone else. Although we are aware of our shortcomings, we continue to support them, perpetuate them, and declare our total and complete inability to change them. Such a negative attitude has no ground whatever in the natural equipment of the individual. We can change any attitude that we desire to change, and we can change it as quickly as that desire becomes sufficiently strong. There's no bad habit or negative attitude which cannot be controlled. Lack of control does not usually arise from basic inability, but from fundamental indolence on the part of the individual. He doesn't wish to accept or assume the responsibility for change. He does not wish to impose upon himself any restrictions which require thoughtfulness, patience, or attentiveness. He is much more apt to sacrifice a useful position in society than to make any direct and determined resolution to improve his own character. While this situation remains unchanged, basic errors will continue to go uncorrected. Nature, and nature alone, has the remedy in its keeping. The universe in which we live is ruled by immutable laws and principles. And according to these principles, each of us must sow and reap in a certain ratio. Whatever causes we set in motion will produce their inevitable reactions. We are indifferent about creating negative causes, but we are seldom indifferent to the miseries or misfortunes that ultimately come upon us. We wish to be spared the consequences of action, and have not yet realized that this is possible only for the individual who changes the course of action in the first place. It would appear then that in the problem of jealousy we are dealing with universally distributed basic human emotion. Yet jealousy exists only because of the fact that we have never matured our own emotional lives, and a symptom of a perpetual adolescence within the person who suffers from it. It indicates that the person has never accepted the challenge of his own growth and has never truly and honorably acknowledged that he is in this world to prove himself, to control those appetites and emotions which have been destructive since the time of primitive man. We are all primitive to a degree beneath the thin veneer of our so-called cultural accomplishments. And when we are confronted with the evidence of our own immaturity, two courses of action are obviously open to us. The first is to accept the challenge of immaturity and realize that the moment we perform an action or hold a thought or tolerate an emotion which is unworthy of our intellectual, moral, and spiritual natures, we should accept this as an indication of need for immediate self-improvement. This is the positive acceptance, the lawful one, and the one which, if followed and obeyed, will ultimately give us liberation and release from a wide variety of disasters. The rejection of the invitation to growth usually manifests itself in hysterical outbursts of disposition. The individual is miserable, turns upon his associates, accusing them of being the cause of his trouble, and tries to shift responsibility from his own immaturity to those about him. This is a rejection of the lesson of experience, and means that the person is unwilling, emotionally or mentally, to acknowledge his own need. Whenever we are inadequate, we are overwhelmed. But when we are adequate, we set to work quietly and systematically to put the situation in proper order. Thus, intensities, uncontrollable and by nature destructive, always reveal to the individual that he is not equal to the challenge of circumstances, and that he is not as well adapted or adjusted as the emergency calls for. He must also realize that after such a discovery, he lives in a condition of perpetual emergency. Once he has admitted defeat to himself, once he has realized that he is not strong enough to guide his own destiny constructively and intelligently, he opens himself to innumerable disasters. Even if, by one evasion or another, he escapes the immediate crisis, it will return. The problem will repeat itself again and again in his life until it is solved. Once a problem appears, the natural inclination to accept, compromise, and follow the course of least resistance is opposed by a dawning realization that in matters of our own character, temperament, and principles, there can be no successful compromise. It is just the same as attempting to compromise with dictators. When we are dealing with a despot, we must use firmness, clarity of purpose, and absolute determination. Our own emotions are more despotic than any Hitler, Stalin, or Mussolini. Yet where our attitudes are concerned, we are so desirous of avoiding and evading a factual acceptance of responsibility that we like to believe that we can do business with a dictator. We like to believe that we can trust the word of a person who has never been trustworthy, or that we can expect cooperation from a power which has never cooperated with man since the dawn of history. Jealousy is such a power, and man can never hope to enjoy any internal security or peace of mind as long as jealousy is dominant in his life. He must face these issues, for failure to do so leaves him a victim of innumerable difficulties. We say that jealousy is a native, primitive instinct. We find traces of it in the lower kingdom of nature, and we observe it strongly in the rising cultures of mankind. We also know, however, that the flowering of any positive or negative emotion depends to a measure upon the opportunity for these various qualities to exhibit themselves. Today we live in a very intense world, a world in which the struggle for survival or for security is largely on the plane of excessive luxury. This struggle consumes time and energy, and the average person is tired, worried, and feels more or less insecure most of the time. He finds his desires so numerous, his ambition so great, that it is difficult for him to adjust to a moderate course of personal conduct. It seems that in every department of his living, moderation is penalized and success lies along roads of excessive action. He begins to feel that only through an almost irresistible ambition can he hope to attain to a place of distinction. All of these pressures seem to justify, or at least condone, intensive negative emotions in man. Talking with one individual who was suffering from a long and disastrous career of jealousy, I tried to explain to him some of these problems, and his answer was typical of our times. He pointed out that everyone is jealous, and that it is therefore obviously natural and normal to man. There are many who hold this attitude, and when they are told that they are showing bad traits of temperament, they simply reply, "You have the same problems. Everyone has the same problems. Why preach to me?" This is a nice little wrapped-up package of evasion. It solves nothing, but seems to give the individual a justification for being what he should not be. Actually, no justification is possible. We can consider other problems on the same level. We can say without exaggeration that probably the majority of human beings suffer from the common head cold. It is one of the most frequent ailments in the world, and as far as we know, no actual cure is yet available for it. Millions of human beings every day suffer from sniffles, yet no one can have enough head colds, and no number of persons can collectively have them to such a degree that they are normal or natural or healthy or desirable. The fact that everyone we know has a head cold does not mean that it is not a sickness, nor does it mean that it cannot, if neglected, lead to more serious complications involving even the survival of the individual himself. It follows by this type of thinking that errors perpetuated by great numbers of persons are still errors, and if every human being had them, they would still be wrong. There is no excuse, therefore, in nature or in the life of man for permitting wrongs or evils to continue in their ways without any effort to prevent their manifestation, at least within ourselves. The answer, as we have intimated, lies on the level of our philosophy of life. The individual who is larger than his problem is not plagued. Jealousy represents, therefore, a level of conscious function. It represents an individual who has not yet reached a serenity of spirit within himself, a person who is part of a large group which is seeking symbolic satisfaction for its own excesses of attitude. Jealousy is peculiar to those who are still of a mind to blame others for their own troubles, and this level, while common, is comparatively low in the order of social development. The longer we blame others, the longer it will be before we face the truth, and that truth is that each individual's security is basically in his own keeping. The only person who can seriously damage us is yourself, and the only person who can help us to recover from this damage is also yourself. Were it otherwise, there could be no justice in the universe. If our happiness and security were truly and factually dependent upon the conduct of others, there could be no law and order, no retribution or reward. Each person would be a member of a hopeless collective chaos. It follows that the only possible way in which a man can assume the proprietorship of his destiny is by taking a lead in the management of his own conduct. Let us consider what is at stake if the individual refuses to outgrow such emotions as jealousy and envy. The results which they produce are actually emotional diseases. They are just as much a sickness as epilepsy, tuberculosis, or arterial sclerosis. Furthermore, jealousy and envy are infectious and contagious diseases because the individual, by intensifying these attitudes in himself, arouses them in those around him, leading to dissatisfaction and discord in their lives. Also, we know that jealousy and envy as ailments hasten the fulfillment of their own worst expectations. The individual who is jealous long enough and unreasonably enough is going to sacrifice the affection and friendship of the person about whom he is jealous. The individual who is envious is going to become so absorbed in his own emotions that he will not fit himself for advancement on a constructive level of action. With these negative emotions, therefore, the fulfillment of fears and doubts is an inevitable correlative of the emotion itself. Thus, the best way to lose a friendship is to be jealous, and the best way to lose a loved one is to permit jealousy mechanisms to destroy the harmony and pleasure of living. In time, consequently, the jealous person is nearly always right, at least to himself, because the thing which he believed might happen does happen, but the fact is that he has caused it to happen. He has taken a situation which might in itself have been meaningless, and by constant irritation, nagging, and unpleasantness, has destroyed the very regards he cherished and desired to preserve. He may blame some other person, but that person probably has very little, if any, part in the tragedy which ultimately comes about. Buddha recognized that intense possessiveness is a moral disease, and he explained where it originates, declaring that all diseases have a common origin. Just as most human physical sickness probably originally arose from lack of sanitation and the inability of primitive man to rationalize the problems of hygiene. So moral diseases such as jealousy and envy arise from that plague-stricken area at the root of all infirmity in man, which we commonly term ignorance. Ignorance is a very interesting and compound and mysterious thing. It has nothing to do with schooling, and although schooling may assist in overcoming it, it is deeper than the problems that can be met by any educational program such as we know. Basically, ignorance is the individual's failure to understand his true place in the plan of life. Any person who has no valid concept regarding his origin, why he is here or where he is going, is ignorant, regardless of whatever else he may know. Also, anyone who has not yet realized that selfishness is a disaster is ignorant, regardless of how beautifully he may be able to calculate an advanced mathematical formula. Many persons will say that such ignorance is inevitable and that no individual can be absolutely certain of these vast universals of which he is so small and comparatively irrelevant a part. Yet ignorance can be relatively treated. It is ultimately curable, and at any particular stage in life it can be successfully treated so that its immediate danger is mitigated. This type of enlightenment is of the greatest utility in controlling human life. Man may not know the answers to everything, but one simple way of bringing life into conformity with a pattern is to recognize that through the ages, man, by experience, has accumulated instinctive and factual knowledge of a great many of the rules governing his own character and existence. Any individual, therefore, who wishes to take the time or energy to improve himself in the basic understanding of mankind may begin by recognizing that this is an honest universe, ruled over honestly, and that honesty must therefore be the course of human action most likely to produce constructive results. This realization is a wonderful remedial agent for the prevailing ignorance. We begin to outgrow ignorance the moment we begin to outgrow negation within ourselves. No one today is completely ignorant, and no one is yet completely wise. Somewhere in the middle distance between these two extremes, men live and move and have their being. We are all entitled to make use of the accumulated essential wisdom of our time, and we find magnificent statements of this wisdom in the great scriptural revelations that have been given to man since the dawn of his existence. No individual can remain completely ignorant who can, with depth of understanding and contrition of spirit and heart, accept and live the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, or the basic teachings of such great philosophers and leaders as Buddha, Lao Tzu, Confucius, or Plato. These basic teachings help the individual to integrate a practical course of conduct. Their eternal value is that they are applicable to us today, and by their application, we can liberate our own hearts and souls from the uncertainties and disasters of uncontrolled impulses. Man lives in a certain conflict with himself in which he is seeking to gain control of subjective pressures, which cause him to take aggravated or aggressive attitudes on various matters. There are some who attempt, by a tremendous exertion of willpower, to change the strange and mysterious monsters that lurk within their psychic life. This conflict of willpower, this eternal vigilance, this resolution which manifests itself by clenching the jaw, refusing to say the unpleasant word. All of this is rather exhausting, but does not contribute to moral growth. There is a great truth in the biblical statement that, as a man thinketh in his heart, so is he. The correction can never lie in the mere frustration of symptoms. The individual who is jealous within himself but has resolved not to exhibit it is still jealous, and all his resolution will never cure him. Gradually, the tension will rise between the pressures from within and the resistance from without, and he will ultimately come into another kind of trouble, which is perhaps even more serious than the original jealousy itself. Therefore, if he's to correct these conditions, he must correct them through understanding them and through making certain basic changes in his own concepts toward life, so that a new way of living is not difficult or strange or even especially virtuous. We all like to be considered virtuous and to gain a reputation for suffering for principles. This is a gentle, kindly type of martyrdom that brings with it a wonderful feeling of self-satisfaction. Self-satisfaction, however, is just as stupid an emotion as jealousy or envy. All of these emotions are childish and unworthy of a mature person. To overcome them means that we must understand beyond them, above them, through them, until within ourselves we have come to a natural and relaxed conviction that they are wrong. Then they can no longer rise within us because we do not supply them with the necessary energy with which to function. All things like envy, jealousy, hate, worry, fear must be energized by having importance bestowed upon them. To maintain them, we must vitalize them with human magnetism and electricity from the very life materials which we need in order to survive as physical and moral creatures. Therefore, if we decline to furnish the necessary energy to these attitudes, they cannot become dangerous or aggressive factors in our living or thinking. To remove this energy simply means that we have reached a degree of understanding in which these pressures are no longer important. And if they are not important, they fade away. In order to accomplish this, we must develop a basic approach to life which permits the release through our psychic nature of constructive and progressive instincts and impulses. Thus, By the gradual cultivation of our natures, we will gain more than any head-on assault against certain immediate and obvious faults. All faults are admissions of inferiority. They are indications that the individual is not as great as good, or as capable as he wishes others to believe him to be. Perhaps this in itself, on the level of vanity, another peculiar and elusive emotion, would help us to overcome our larger enemies. We must learn to realize that whenever we are intemperate emotionally, we are revealing an inferior phase of ourselves, a phase which is neither lovable nor apt to cause us to be respected or admired. Usually, however, by the time jealousy and envy have become set in the individual's life, he has reached that peculiar degree of toxic control in which he says simply and resolutely, "I don't care what anyone thinks of me. I'm going to do exactly what I feel like doing." This is an advanced case one in which the psychic toxin has risen to such a degree that it has numbed the brain centers and has almost completely destroyed perspective on any subject. This person is in real trouble, and long before he has reached this state, he has put a number of individuals at disadvantage because they, having no more resources than he has, have been influenced. The guilt of the so-called responsible person, however, is not basically what he does to others. His real guilt is how he has misused, perverted, and variously misrepresented the divine life within himself. Man's greatest sin is against the God within, and it is only due to the fact that he lives in a world of common ignorance that his ills affect others. He is most responsible and most punishable for the misuse of his own resources. Having reached the "I don't care" state in his psychic illness, he is then to be treated and cured only by a long process in nature. Human beings can help each other to the degree that they want to be helped. But when it is no longer possible to reach a person on the level of common sense, friendliness, or simple constructive advice, when the individual is perhaps so locked within himself that he would not seek assistance from the greatest expert alive and will never admit his own faults, then it is necessary for us to remember that all these things are basically in the keeping of a power greater than our own. The one thing that no man can ever outwit is universal law. This, like the mill of the gods, grinds slowly but exceedingly fine, and the individual who has so closed himself to improvement that he can no longer help himself and cannot receive help must face the long corrective pattern of universal procedure. It is safe to say, no matter what his state may be, that nature will ultimately win, because nature has a strange inevitability, a wonderful personality which transcends the greatest genius of mortal. It has infinite resources and infinite time, and against these, even the most perfect human conspiracy is of no avail. To be continued. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment, and if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.